On a foggy morning in a small harbor town, James Carter stood in his modest kitchen, clutching a crisp envelope in his weathered hands. The mist outside rolled off the water like ghosts of memories he'd long stopped naming, while the faint scent of engine grease and yesterday's coffee clung to the air, heavy with unspoken regrets. A small oak box sat untouched on his dresser, gathering dust since the last Veterans Day he'd spent alone. A box that held a piece of his soul he wasn't sure he could face again. A soft country melody drifted from the radio on the counter, its notes gentle and unassuming, yet somehow etching themselves into the silence of the room. James didn't hum along. He stood in his faded house slippers, his eyes tracing the government-issued font on the envelope addressed to James T. Carter. The postmark read County Office, and as his thumb brushed the rough edge, a flicker of unease stirred in his chest. Why now? What could they possibly want from a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing in return? He didn't open it right away. Instead, he shuffled to a small, weathered table by the window, the chair groaning beneath him like an old friend muttering a familiar complaint. Just then, a soft tap echoed at the door, and Clara Hensley stepped inside, her voice warm as she held up a foil-covered plate. "I brought apple bread, fresh from last night's oven," she said with a gentle smile. She set the plate down, her gaze flickering between the unopened envelope and James's unshaven jaw. "You okay, James?" she asked, her tone laced with quiet concern. He tore the envelope open with a careful pull, his eyes scanning the text once, then again, as if hoping the words might change. "It's a summons," he said, his voice flat but heavy. "Illegal parking, they claim." Clara's brow furrowed, her hands stilling on the table. "You haven't taken that truck past the pier in months." James nodded, his jaw tight. "They say I blocked a redevelopment zone, the old memorial on Pine Street. They're tearing it down for apartments." His words carried a weight that settled between them, a silent protest against a world that seemed to forget too easily. Clara sat across from him, her voice softening. "I remember that memorial. My cousin's name is etched on one of those stones. He never came back to see it." James walked to the hallway closet, passing faded black and white photographs of soldiers on the wall, some with names scribbled beneath, others left blank, their faces blurred by time. He reached for a small oak box, its hinges tarnished but polished, resting atop a knitted scarf from decades past. The box felt heavy, not with physical weight, but with the memories it held. He brought it to the table and lifted the lid with a reverence that made the air feel sacred. Inside, nestled against worn velvet, a bronze star gleamed in the pale morning light. Its ribbon was frayed at the edges, but the engraving on the back remained sharp. James T. Carter, DAC 2, 1969. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching at the sight, her fingers hovering as if afraid to touch something so sacred. "I'm going to the courthouse," James said, his voice steady, his eyes not meeting hers. "Taking that with you?" she asked softly. "Not for them," he replied, a flicker of resolve in his tone. "For me, to see if it still means anything." Clara's eyes glistened, a sheen of tears catching the light. "That metal's gathered dust longer than some folks have been alive," she whispered. James's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Doesn't change what it cost," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken memories. They sat in a silence that felt holy, the kind that holds space for shared loss and understanding. Clara spoke again, her voice barely audible. "My cousin, he never liked fanfare either. That's why we sat together at every parade, you and me." The memory hung between them, fragile but warm, a thread connecting their grief. James stood, the floorboards creaking under his boots as he moved to a back room. From a corner cabinet, he pulled a canvas bag, its fabric worn but sturdy, containing a shaving kit, an old map of the town folded thrice, and a notebook listing 6 names, only 3 still living. He packed with care, wrapping the metal in a cotton handkerchief he'd carried through the war, tucking it back into the box like a soldier folding a flag. A faded photo on the fridge caught his eye. Him, younger, with comrades leaning against a barricade, their smiles frozen in time. "Henry, Marcus gone?" he murmured, tracing the photo's edge with a trembling finger, his whisper too soft to carry beyond the moment. Outside, the morning brightened, the fog lifting to reveal a harbor town stirring to life. A seagull cried over the water, and the bakery on Shore Lane set out its chairs, their metal frames glinting in the early sun. James had visited every Thursday for years, always leaving a $1 tip for his coffee, a ritual as steady as the tides. As he slid a thermos into his truck's cup holder, the driver's seat creaked under his weight. A seashell air freshener dangled from the mirror, its scent long faded, but its presence a ritual he couldn't abandon. He didn't wave to Clara as he pulled out, but he left the porch light on, a beacon of return, a promise to come back. Listeners, let's journey together into a story of honor, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of veterans who've shaped our nation's heart. At Daily Narrated Stories, we bring you tales that remind us to cherish those who've served, to hold space for their sacrifices, and to honor their legacy. If you're moved by stories of courage and gratitude, subscribe to our channel today. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Share your love for the country, your touching memories, and your gratitude for veterans in the comments below. Let's celebrate the heroes among us. The courthouse smelled of lemon polish and bureaucracy, a sterile scent that clung to the walls like a thin veneer of order. But the air grew tense, almost suffocating, the moment James opened his oak box. At first, no one noticed him standing at the back of the room, clutching the box as if it might crumble in his hands. The docket droned on with the monotony of routine. Petty disputes over parking violations, a noise complaint from a neighbor, a heated argument about a property line that had spiraled into legal drama. A clerk typed with one hand, sipping lemonade with the other, her nails clicking against the glass. Two women near the front whispered about holiday recipes, their voices a soft hum, while a father scrolled his phone, his young daughter building towers with pretzels on the bench beside him, her giggles a fleeting burst of light in the heavy room. "James Carter," the clerk called, her voice cutting through the murmur. James rose slowly, his bad hip catching on the slick tile, the echo of his worn boots reverberating in the artificial hush. The leather, softened by years of wear, seemed to carry a story of its own, each scuff a testament to battles fought and miles walked. No one looked up, not yet. Their eyes were fixed on their own small dramas, their own mundane concerns, blind to the man who carried a history they couldn't fathom. Nathan Brooks, a prosecutor in his early 30s, adjusted his tie with a sharp tug, his voice too loud for the room, as if he needed to fill the space with his authority. "Mr. Carter," he said, each syllable clipped and deliberate, "you're cited for obstructing access to a city redevelopment site." His tone was cold, mechanical, a man who wore policy like armor, shielding himself from the humanity of the moment. James didn't reply. He approached the bench, his steps slow and measured, and placed the box down with a reverence that seemed to slow time itself. His movements were deliberate, as if he'd vowed never to hurry for anyone ever again, a quiet defiance in the face of a world that moved too fast. Nathan barely glanced at the box, his eyes flicking over it with disinterest, as if it were just another piece of clutter in his day. "I'm not sure what that is," he said, his voice sharp, "but this isn't the place for personal tales or war anecdotes." The words landed like a slap in an empty room, harsh and unfeeling, a dismissal that cut deeper than he could know. Judge Margaret Ellison looked up from her notes, her glasses catching the light as her gaze lingered on James, then on the box. She said nothing, her silence a heavy presence, waiting for the moment to unfold. James lifted the lid, revealing the bronze star nestled inside, its surface catching the fluorescent light like a quiet flame against the worn velvet. The metal seemed to glow with a dignity untouched by time, its edges sharp, its ribbon frayed but proud. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a wave of curiosity tinged with skepticism. "Is that real?" someone whispered, their voice too loud to be polite, carrying a hint of doubt. Probably bought it at a thrift store. Another scoffed, a chuckle trailing their words, the sound grating against the stillness. James stood motionless, his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls, perhaps on a battlefield in Dak 2, where the air had been thick with smoke and the screams of the wounded had pierced the night. "It was real enough to die for," he said, his voice low but steady, carried by the microphone with a quiet power that seemed to anchor the room. But the crowd didn't hush. Instead, laughter bubbled up, a nervous, mocking sound that filled the space where respect should have been. A woman in the back muttered, her voice dripping with cynicism, "Probably wants a break on the fine." The words hung in the air, a cruel reminder of how easily sacrifice could be dismissed. Nathan crossed his arms, his posture rigid. "Mr. Carter, the city honors veterans, but this is a civil matter," he said, his tone clipped, as if the matter were already decided. James's reply was soft, weary, carrying the weight of a lifetime of being overlooked. "Maybe the city needs to honor better." His words weren't loud, weren't angry, just tired, a quiet plea for a world that had forgotten too much. Judge Ellison raised a hand, silencing the room. Not out of respect, but out of routine, her authority a reflex in the face of chaos. "Mr. Carter, do you have a statement?" she asked, her tone measured, her eyes searching his face for something unspoken. James's fingers hovered over the metal, not touching it, as if afraid to disturb its sanctity. "No statement," he said, his voice steady. "Just wanted to see if it still mattered." The simplicity of his words cut through the noise, a raw honesty that left the room momentarily still. In the corner, Ethan, a college student there for a class project on local government, adjusted his camera lens, his hands trembling slightly. He'd been bored, half-heartedly snapping photos of the mundane proceedings. Until now. Something about James's stillness, the weight in his posture, the way he carried the box like a piece of his heart, made Ethan lift his camera and snap a photo. The shutter's click echoed like a heartbeat in the quiet, a sound that seemed to mark the moment as something sacred. Judge Ellison's eyes narrowed, her gaze sweeping the gallery, then returning to the box, as if she sensed a shift in the air. Nathan scoffed, his voice cutting through the stillness like a shard of glass. "It's a parking ticket, Your Honor, not a war memorial." Laughter broke out again, sharp and uneasy, the kind that fills a void when people don't know how to face dignity when it stands before them. It wasn't humor. It was discomfort, a refusal to acknowledge the weight of what James carried. Ethan lowered his camera, his hands trembling, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He'd photographed countless events, school plays, football games, even a chaotic family reunion, but nothing had ever felt like this. In the back row, a man with salt and pepper hair and steady eyes shifted, his presence subtle but commanding. Daniel Hayes, a retired Marine, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on James with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. The room's chatter slowed, not by force, but by an unspoken shift, a ripple of something greater moving through the space. Daniel stood, unprompted, his movements deliberate, as if every step were a decision made long ago. He walked down the aisle, his boots tapping softly against the worn tile, each step a quiet echo of battles fought and brothers lost. There was no swagger in his stride, no hesitation, just a man who had seen too much to be unsure of what he was doing. James didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. Some footsteps carry a history you can't forget, a rhythm etched into the soul by shared survival. Daniel reached the table, pausing before the open box, the bronze star resting quietly inside, as if it had always belonged there. He exhaled, a sound heavy with reverence, and lifted the metal with clean, strong fingers, holding it as if it were a folded flag at a soldier's funeral. The room, moments ago alive with snickers and whispers, fell silent. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, dust motes dancing in its rays like tiny witnesses to a moment of grace. The clerk stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. A reporter paused her scrolling, her phone forgotten in her hand. Even Nathan froze mid-breath, his earlier confidence suspended in the stillness. Daniel turned the medal over, reading the inscription to himself. James T. Carter, DAC 2, 1969. He looked at the judge, then the gallery, his voice steady, not loud, but carrying a weight that filled the room. This man saved lives, mine among them. No one stirred. The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the silence. He stepped closer to James, their eyes meeting, a shared history passing between them in a single breath, decades of unspoken gratitude condensed into a moment. Daniel raised his hand in a salute, not ceremonial, but raw, born of blood and survival. The kind of gesture you learn not in training, but in the chaos of war. James didn't return it, but he stood taller, his shoulders squaring as he watched a piece of his past finally be seen, acknowledged, honored. Judge Ellison rose from her seat, her hand resting on her chest, not mimicking Daniel, but remembering her own loss. A telegram in 1985, a photo of her brother still tucked in her desk drawer, its edges worn from years of quiet grief. Her breath caught, a silent tribute to a pain she rarely spoke of. Nathan's gaze dropped to the desk, his papers forgotten, his earlier confidence dissolving with the echo of Daniel's steps. Whatever protest he'd been forming faded into the stillness, swallowed by the weight of the moment. Ethan's hands shook as he held his camera, unable to press the shutter. This moment felt too fragile, as if capturing it might break its sanctity. He'd photographed countless events, but none carried this weight, this raw, unspoken power. Daniel lowered his arm, placing the medal back in its box with a tenderness that spoke louder than words, his movements careful, as if he were returning a piece of James's heart. Judge Ellison's voice broke the silence, her tone soft but firm. Court will recess. Perhaps it's time we listen. The words hung in the air, a quiet command that felt more like a plea, a call to remember, to honor, to see. The room didn't stir, even during the recess. It was as if the air itself had turned sacred, holding space for something greater than the petty disputes that had filled the docket. Outside, the sun illuminated the courthouse lawn, glinting off flagpoles adorned with red, white, and blue ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. Workers hung a banner for the upcoming Memorial Day parade, their movements quiet, respectful, as if they sensed the weight of the moment unfolding inside. Judge Ellison returned after a few minutes, her robe trailing behind her like a shadow of history, her presence a reminder of the justice she was sworn to uphold. She adjusted her glasses, her voice low but steady. "I've reviewed the citation," she began, her words measured. "While the city's procedures are clear, I find this case morally insignificant." Nathan shifted in his seat, his mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came, his earlier bravado silenced by the shift in the room. "The site was a place of remembrance," the judge continued, her voice gaining strength. "A memorial may lose its funding, its signage, but it does not lose its meaning. Not to those who've sacrificed, not to those who remember." She turned to James, her eyes softening with a rare warmth. "The charge is dismissed. Thank you, Mr. Carter." Her words were more than a ruling. They were a recognition, a restoration of dignity to a man who'd carried his honor in silence for too long. James didn't speak, didn't nod. He reached forward, closing the box with both hands, his fingers lingering as if to seal the moment, to hold on to the fleeting sense of being seen. Nathan gathered his papers, his movements stiff, his chair scraping loudly against the tile, a sound that felt too bright, too harsh in the hushed room. He left without a backward glance, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet retreat. Daniel remained seated, his hands clasped in front of him, a silent sentinel bearing witness to the moment. As Judge Ellison stood to leave, Daniel rose and approached James, his steps slow, deliberate. "You pulled me out of hell," he said, his voice rough but steady, each word a stone laid on the foundation of their shared history. "I never thanked you." James met his gaze, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Not surprise, not emotion exactly, but a deep understanding that needed no words. I didn't know who I was saving, James replied, his voice quiet, the memory of that day intact flashing behind his eyes. The smoke, the screams, the weight of a stranger on his shoulder. I know, Daniel said, tapping the side of the box gently, a gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes. But I do. The two men exchanged no further words, no embrace, no handshake, just a quiet understanding that passed between them like a folded flag from one hand to another, a silent acknowledgement of a debt that could never be fully repaid. Outside, Clara waited on the courthouse steps, a thermos clutched in her hands, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. She handed it to James without a word, her eyes searching his face for a sign of what had happened inside. He unscrewed the lid, the coffee still warm, its steam rising like a small comfort in the crisp air. Told you someone would remember, she said softly, her voice a gentle reassurance. James's mouth lifted slightly, just enough to matter, a flicker of hope in his weathered face. Volunteers set up chairs on the lawn, their metal frames clinking softly as they prepared for the Memorial Day events to come. A young girl placed small flags along the path, her hands careful, as if each one held a story, a life, a sacrifice. Judge Ellison emerged, stepping down from the bench, an unprecedented act in the town's memory, and extended her hand to James. He looked at it for a moment, then stood, their handshake firm, steady, quiet, a gesture that spoke of mutual respect. The courtroom watched in awe, the silence a testament to the moment's gravity. Ethan reviewed his photo on the camera screen. James at the front, the medal in its box, sunlight falling on his shoulders. A weight finally lifted, a burden shared. He uploaded it to his blog with a single word, honor. Beneath the image, he wrote, "Some men wear their medals on their chest. Others carry them in their silence." The words felt like a prayer, a tribute to a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, painting the scene in hues of gold and amber. A Memorial Day flyer fluttered on a lamppost, its edges curling in the breeze, while down the street a school band practiced, their notes off-key but earnest, a reminder of a community that still tried, even when it faltered. James sat on a stone ledge, thermos in hand, the box beside him, its presence louder than ever, a quiet hum of history that refused to be forgotten. Ethan lingered nearby, his camera hanging from a strap across his chest, his thumbs fidgeting with the edge of his jacket sleeves. He glanced at James, then away, then back again, a nervous energy buzzing beneath his skin. Finally, he took a breath, as if stepping off a ledge, and spoke. "Sir, may I ask something?" James glanced over, his eyes steady, assessing. "You already are," he said, his voice dry, but not unkind. Ethan laughed nervously, his cheeks flushing. "Right, sorry. I mean, what happened back then with the medal? What's its story?" James studied him for a moment. The boy was young, uncertain, his frame slight, but his eyes held steady, a spark of genuine curiosity that counted for something. James nodded toward a bakery across the street, a sign in the window reading, "Veterans 15% off. With love, Seaport." "Let's talk over coffee," he said, his voice gruff but warm, an invitation to share a piece of history he'd carried alone for too long. Inside, the bakery smelled of vanilla and fresh bread, a comforting warmth that wrapped around them like a hug. The barista smiled at James, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Your usual, hon?" she asked, already pouring a cup from a fresh pot. "2 sugars, black," he said with a nod. She glanced at Ethan and Daniel, who had followed them in, her smile widening. "Friends of yours?" James looked at Daniel, who gave a faint nod, a silent agreement. "Something like that," James said, the words carrying a weight of newfound connection. They settled into a booth near the back, the vinyl seats creaking softly under their weight. James sipped his coffee, the steam rising in delicate curls, his gaze drifting to the window before settling on Ethan. "It was DAC 2, November 1969, he began, his voice steady but distant, as if he were stepping back into memory, feeling the heat of that day on his skin. Command said the area was secure. It wasn't. He paused, the silence heavy, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. We were delivering food supplies, just a routine run, nothing special. Then the first explosion hit. He continued, his voice tightening, the memory vivid in his mind. The supply tent burned fast, flames everywhere, screams cutting through the smoke like knives. The air felt thin, like I was drowning on land, the heat pressing against my chest, the sound fading into a hollow ring. Ethan leaned in, his breath shallow, hanging on every word, afraid to interrupt. I heard a boy, maybe 19, calling for his mother. James said, his voice cracking just slightly, the rawness of the memory breaking through. I didn't know his name, never saw his face, but his voice, it broke something in me, tore at me like shrapnel. James stared at his mug, the coffee still steaming, a small anchor in the storm of his memories. I wasn't brave, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just couldn't live with myself if I let that voice fade. I ran through the fire, the heat searing my skin, the smoke choking my lungs, and I dragged him out. Didn't stop to think, just acted because I couldn't bear to hear another kid call for his mama and not answer. The words hung heavy, raw with the weight of survival, the air thick with the unspoken cost of that moment. Daniel, silent until now, reached into his jacket and unfolded a cloth, his movements careful, deliberate. Inside was his Marine insignia, its edges worn but the gold still gleaming with pride. He set it gently beside James's box, a quiet offering. That day made me who I am, he said, his voice low, the words a confession, a gratitude that had waited decades to be spoken. James didn't respond, didn't need to. His eyes lingered on the insignia, a flicker of recognition passing through them, a shared understanding that needed no words. A few locals glanced over, their expressions shifting from curiosity to respect, their earlier indifference replaced by quiet awe. They didn't approach. They sensed the sanctity of the moment, the sacred space that had formed around the three men in the booth. Across town, Clara sat at the old memorial on Pine Street, her fingers tracing her cousin's name on the weathered stone, the letters rough against her skin. She remembered his laugh, the way he'd promised to come home, and the telegram that arrived instead, its words cold and final. Her fingers trembled as she whispered, "You'd have liked James." The moment deepened her bond with James, her quiet grief a mirror to his own, a shared understanding of loss that needed no explanation. Ethan spoke softly, his voice quieter than before, as if afraid to shatter the moment. "If it's okay, I'd like to share your story." James didn't answer right away, his mind drifting back to Dak to the smell of burning canvas, the weight of the boy on his shoulder, the fear he'd buried deep to keep moving, to survive. The memory was a wound that had never fully healed, a scar that ached in the quiet moments. But Ethan's earnestness, his genuine desire to honor the story, stirred something in James, a flicker of hope that his sacrifice might still mean something. He finally nodded, his voice gruff but warm. "Tell if you think it matters." Ethan's eyes lit up with purpose, a young man transformed by the weight of a story he now carried, a responsibility he felt in his bones. James wasn't at the Memorial Day ceremony, but his presence lingered in every flag, every salute, every quiet moment of reflection. The park buzzed with life as the town gathered to honor its heroes. Folding chairs lined the lawn, dew glistening on their frames like tears of gratitude. A military band tuned up near the pavilion, their trumpets wavering but determined, while children in pressed uniforms waved tiny flags with pride, their small hands clutching the stars and stripes as if they understood the weight of what they held. Ethan stood by a new bench, mahogany, anchored in granite, a symbol of permanence in a world that too often forgot. A plaque lay beneath a silk cloth, waiting for its reveal, its presence a quiet promise of recognition. Ethan's hands rested on a folded American flag, its creases softened by years of James's care, the fabric carrying the weight of countless memories. Daniel arrived in his Marine dress blues, the uniform stiff on his broad frame, a sharp contrast to the softness in his eyes. It was his first time wearing it since retirement, a choice made to honor James, to stand as a witness to his sacrifice. Judge Ellison joined them, escorted by the mayor, her navy dress simple but elegant, a single gold pin at her collar catching the light. Her expression was stoic, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion as she saw the bench, a memory stirring beneath the surface, a memory of her brother, of the day she'd lost him, of the quiet strength it took to carry on. The townsfolk gathered around them, veterans in patched jackets, their medals glinting with pride, bakery workers still in their aprons, flour dusting their sleeves, teens clutching flagpoles, their nervous energy a reminder of youth learning the weight of history, and Clara, in her familiar scarf, standing quietly with her hands clasped, her presence a steady anchor in the crowd. Ethan spoke, his voice steady despite the lack of a microphone, his words carrying across the park with a quiet power. He placed the flag on the bench, his hands lingering as if reluctant to let go, then stepped back. Daniel moved forward, addressing the crowd, his voice low but resonant. He showed up when it mattered. He said, each word a vow, a reminder. Let's not forget how. The words landed like a promise, a call to remember the quiet heroes who'd shaped their lives, their community, their nation. Judge Ellison stepped up, her fingers brushing the silk cloth, the gesture tender, almost reverent. With a graceful motion, she unveiled the plaque, its bronze surface catching the sunlight. Some honors aren't worn, they're carried. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled over the crowd, a truth that resonated in their hearts. Silence fell, deep and reverent, a collective breath held in honor of a man who'd given so much and asked for so little. Clara's voice broke through, soft but clear, a gentle command that carried the weight of her own loss. Would you stand? The crowd rose as one, chairs creaking in unison, the sound a quiet symphony of gratitude. No one spoke, no one recorded, just pure, shared reverence, a moment of stillness that felt like a prayer. Clara saluted, her fingers trembling but firm, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Others followed, some hesitant, some resolute, their gestures a patchwork of respect and gratitude. A church bell tolled once, its echo a solemn heartbeat across the park, a reminder of the lives lost, the sacrifices made. In the front row, the barista from the bakery dabbed her eyes with a napkin, letting her tears fall freely, unashamed of the emotion that overwhelmed her. A boy in a scout uniform stared at the plaque, his young face serious, the word service taking on new meaning, a lesson he'd carry into his future. Ethan stepped back, pulling a hand-bound book from his bag, its cover rough but cherished. On it, a grainy photo of James in the courtroom, the medal in its box, sunlight falling on his shoulders, a moment of quiet dignity captured forever. He held it up, his voice a whisper, more to the air than the crowd. Stories worth telling, he said, the word a promise to keep James's legacy alive, to ensure that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. On a quiet Memorial Day morning, a flag and a bench spoke for a man who never sought recognition, only understanding. James Carter taught us that true courage isn't loud. It's in the moments when someone acts not for glory, but because it's right, because it's human, because it's what keeps us whole. His story stretched beyond the park, beyond the small harbor town, reminding us that quiet strength endures in a world quick to forget. Like a porch light left on at dawn, simple acts of goodness guide us home, lighting the way for those who've lost their path. What if a single letter could unravel a lifetime of buried sacrifice, forcing a forgotten hero to face a world that no longer remembers? Reflect on this, dear viewers. Who are the quiet heroes in your life? The ones who've shown up when it mattered most? Take a moment to honor them, to share their stories in the comments below, to celebrate the veterans who've shaped our communities, our nation, our hearts. Let's hold space for their sacrifices, for the love of country that drove them, for the courage that defines them. Your stories matter, and we want to hear them. Share them with us today at Daily Narrated Stories. We're committed to bringing you tales that inspire, heal, and connect us to what matters most. Stories of hope, forgiveness, courage, and resilience that remind us of the best in humanity. Don't miss out on this journey. Subscribe now, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Time is fleeting, and your support can help us reach 1,000 subscribers, ensuring these stories of courage live on for generations to come.